This is Leader Time by FedNet, your podcast source for floor remarks by Senate Majority Leader John Thune and Democratic Leader Chuck Schumer during the 119th Congress. On March 3rd, Thune discussed the pending nomination of Linda McMahon to be Secretary of Education and the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act. McMahon was expected to be confirmed to the second Trump administration while the bill faced a procedural vote. The following material is protected by copyright.
Mr. President, the Senate will vote later today to confirm Linda McMahon to be Secretary of Education. Mrs. McMahon is an accomplished businesswoman and public servant. She's known for her role in building World Wrestling Entertainment, better known as WWE, from a small operation to a large and thriving enterprise. And she has used her success to give back and make a positive impact. Mrs. McMahon led efforts to promote reading and civic engagement through WWE. She spent 16 years on the Board of Trustees for Sacred Heart University in her home state of Connecticut. She served on the Connecticut Board of Education. And in his first term, President Trump tapped Linda McMahon to lead the Small Business Administration, where she was known for listening to small businesses to make the SBA a more effective agency. She will bring valuable experience, an incredible work ethic, and a passion for education to her new role leading the Department of Education. And, Mr. President, she has a big task ahead of her. Let's acknowledge that. In January, the nation's report card revealed that American students are still struggling to make up ground lost during the pandemic. Reading scores among 4th and 8th graders declined again after falling in 2022 and 2019. 1/3 of 8th graders are reading below a basic level, the highest proportion ever recorded. Math scores showed modest improvement, but they still remain below pre-pandemic levels. And there's a widening gap in student performance. Mr. President, this should concern all of us. As a son of 2 public school educators and father of 2 daughters who went to public schools, I know this problem isn't going to be fixed by Washington bureaucrats. It's going to be fixed by good teachers, administrators, school boards, and parents, the people who are closest to the students and most invested in their success. Mr. President, the federal government provides less than 10% of funding for schools in this country. The other 90% of funding, money that keeps the lights on, pays teachers, and buys new textbooks, well, that comes from state and local governments and from private sources. But while the federal government provides a small percentage of education funding, it's responsible for an outsized amount of the bureaucracy and mandates in education. And more often than not, it's these policies that are holding back school districts from innovating and ultimately improving the education that they provide. Mr. President, I'm glad that Mrs. McMahon recognizes that education is not one size fits all. States have different needs. School districts and individual schools have different needs. And every student has his or her own needs and aspirations. So I'm glad that Mrs. McMahon plans to work in a way that empowers those closest to the student, because they are in the best position to do what's right for that student. When I met with Mrs. McMahon, we had a long conversation about South Dakota's unique education needs, including our tribal schools. And I look forward to working with Linda McMahon to limit bureaucracy, empower state and local governments, and let good teachers do what they're best at and what they love to do, and that's to help students succeed. Mr. President, most Americans are familiar with Title IX. That was the landmark legislation designed to create equal spaces and opportunities in education for women. Title IX is particularly notable for the effect it's had on women's sports. With its requirement that federal funding recipients create equal athletic opportunities for women and girls, Title IX paved the way for the women's athletic programs we see today at colleges and universities and high schools around the country. But now the gains that have been made through Title IX are under attack. Around the country, we have seen men, biological men who identify as women, take up spaces and medals in athletics meant for actual women. Swimming, track, volleyball, soccer, basketball. This is happening across a range of sports. And Mr. President, the problems here are obvious. First of all, there is the physical danger that can be posed by men participating in women's sports. But this is about much more than any physical danger. This is a matter of fairness and equality. Title IX, as I said, was created to give women opportunities in spaces that have been denied them, to give women the same opportunities that men enjoy. That's not possible when men are involved in women's sports. Biologically, men possess physical advantages when it comes to sports, things like greater muscle mass and greater aerobic power, which means that, by and large, men are likely to dominate in women's sports, taking wins and medal opportunities away from women. And this isn't hypothetical, Mr. President. This is actually happening. Let me quote from an August 2024 United Nations report on violence against women and girls, which addresses the participation of men in women's sports. And I quote, "Policies implemented by international federations and national governing bodies, along with national legislation in some countries, allow males who identify as women to compete in female sports categories. In other cases, this practice is not explicitly prohibited and is thus tolerated in practice. The replacement of the female sports category with a mixed-sex category has resulted in an increasing number of female athletes losing opportunities, including medals, when competing against males. According to information received by March 30th of 2024, over 800 female athletes in more than 400 competitions have lost more than 890 medals in 29 different sports," end quote. Let me just repeat that, Mr. President. According to information received, by 30 March 2024, over 600 female athletes in more than 400 competitions have lost more than 890 medals in 29 different sports. Now that, as I said, is from a United Nations report. This isn't some myth that conservatives have dreamed up. This is happening. Mr. President, I could go down a list of examples here in the United States. The female runner who did not qualify for the women's 55-meter final at the state championship because a biological male identifying as a woman qualified in her place. Another female runner who resigned herself to second place at best because, as she said, she knew there would be no winning against the biological male who finished a full minute and 22 seconds ahead of the second place female finisher. The male pole vaulter who won the women's competition with a vault that exceeded that of the second place female finishers by 6 inches. The women's basketball team that saw nearly half of its season's points scored by a male. And that's just a sampling of the stories that are out there. And of course, Mr. President, the female athletes in question aren't just being robbed of their potential places on the winner's podium. They're also being robbed of the opportunities that might be associated with that place. Things like college scholarships. There's one female runner who was robbed of multiple wins by a biological male described the situation, and I quote, "It robs girls of the chance to race in front of college scouts who show up for elite meets and to compete for the scholarships and opportunities that come with college recruitment. I'll never know how my own college recruitment was impacted by losing those 4 state championship titles to a male. When colleges looked at my record, they didn't see the fastest girl in Connecticut. They saw a second or third place runner." Mr. President, this isn't fair. Girls should not be having to compete in races that are stacked against them. Women deserve their own athletic opportunities, opportunities that are not taken away from them by biological males who have their own spaces in which to compete. They deserve a level playing field. And Mr. President, this is not a niche position. A 2025 New York Times poll found that 79% of Americans including, I might add, a majority of Democrats, believe that biological males identifying as women should not be allowed to play women's sports. And that's not the only poll that's found that a huge majority of Americans believe that women's sports should be for actual women. Mr. President, at the beginning of February, President Trump took action to protect the original meaning of Title IX and ensure that federal funding would not go to schools that allow men to compete as women. As the father of two former female athletes, I am grateful for his commitment to upholding fairness and common sense. Mr. President, my dad, who was a Division I athlete, came back to my hometown, coached women's sports. Girls basketball, girls track. It would have been incomprehensible to him to think biological boys would be competing against his female athletes. But, Mr. President, unfortunately, there's no guarantee that the next president is going to uphold President Trump's measure. And so today we will consider legislation from my colleague, Senator Tuberville, a former high school girls basketball coach, to permanently reinstate the original intent of Title IX and ensure that women, and women only, participate in women's sports at federally funded educational institutions. Now, Mr. President, I'd love to think that we would easily pass this legislation, that Democrats and Republicans would unite and stand with the vast majority of Americans to protect opportunities for women. But given that every single Democrat voted to block this bill last Congress, I have to say I'm concerned about today's outcome. So this will be a time of choosing for Democrats. They can stand with women, or they can stand with a radical transgender ideology that would see women and their opportunities sacrificed to make way for biological males. Democrats can't have it both ways, Mr. President. It's either one or the other. I had a finance professor in graduate school who used to say that some things are just intuitively obvious. Well, this, Mr. President, is one of those things. And if the Democrats vote to oppose this legislation, they'll have to answer to the women and girls they vote to disenfranchise. I hope Democrats will join Republicans to protect women and women's sports and vote to proceed to the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act.
Schumer discussed his guests for President Trump's address to Congress the next evening before a pre-buttal of the president's program. He then remarked on Trump's televised meeting with the president of Ukraine the preceding Friday, continued public concerns about inflation and Social Security.
Now, Mr. President, tomorrow, President Trump will address a joint meeting of Congress for the first time since taking office, the oath of office. It's my honor, my true honor, to welcome 7 incredible New Yorkers tomorrow who will tell the story of what's under threat by Donald Trump's agenda, from Medicaid beneficiaries to disabled veterans fired from their jobs at the VA, to fired USDA workers, to home health care workers. It will also be my profound honor to welcome Orna Nutra, mother of Omer Nutra, and Ruby Chen, father of Itai Chen, both who were tragically killed by vicious Hamas thugs on October 7th. Orna's son, Omer, was taken hostage by Hamas during the attacks on October 7th. It wasn't until over a year later that Omer's family learned he was murdered by Hamas on October 7th. Ruby's son, Itai, was also taken hostage and tragically murdered by Hamas on the border of Gaza on October 7th. After months of fighting for his return, Itai's family learned that he was also killed by Hamas on October 7th. I spoke to Itai's dad, and I spoke to Orna as well, many times between October 7th and when they were notified that their children had been murdered. It was vicious cruelty of Hamas, whose viciousness seems to be part of their way. not to let the families know what had happened. Over and over again, especially Ruby Chen, who I got to know well and we had Brooklyn roots together, would wonder, is he dead? Is he alive? Is he alive? Is he dead? And Hamas kept them dangling, as I said, viciously and cruelly. What Omer and Itai's family have endured is beyond comprehension. But I'm inspired by their perseverance, by their resolve to keep calling for the safe return of remaining hostages and for the return of the bodies of their loved ones. We must bring all the hostages home now. But it's an honor, true honor, to welcome all of my guests, the Nutras, the Chens, and of course the others, to the Capitol. Now, tomorrow, Americans can expect Donald Trump to say many things that are false, including perhaps Russian information. What we will not hear from Donald Trump, however, is the truth. So today, let us speak the truth about Donald Trump's agenda. In a little over a month, Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and Republicans have set in motion the greatest transfer of wealth in favor of billionaires we have seen in modern times. On the one hand, you have Elon Musk calling Social Security the greatest Ponzi scheme of all time. You have Doge firing over 7,000 staffers from the Social Security Administration. You have Donald Trump threatening trade wars with our own allies. And you have Republicans cutting $880 billion from Medicaid to pay for their billionaire tax cuts. Money that funds things like community health centers, money that funds people who desperately need health care, money that funds parents or elderly parents of middle-aged couples in the parents are in nursing homes. All of that is at grave risk. Together, these actions will mean diminished wealth for working and middle Americans and more money in the pockets of the billionaires. Because after all, when the wealthiest man on earth calls Social Security a scam and Doge fires 7,000 Social Security staffers, that's a clear sign Social Security benefits are in danger. Donald Trump just said a few minutes ago that he was going to keep the tariffs against Canada and Mexico. When Donald Trump starts a trade war for Canada and Mexico, it means rising costs for produce, for groceries, for cars, even for ordering takeout and happy hour. It is unbelievable what they're doing with these tariffs. It could mean that restaurant owners in states like mine could be forced to close down as food prices go up. It means that building new homes will be more expensive, and those costs will be passed down to would-be home buyers. The bottom line is very simple. One of the greatest things Americans complained about in the past election was the high costs of so many different kinds of goods and products. And now Donald Trump is making it worse because he just said that he would not continue the pause on Canada and Mexico's tariffs, but will let them go into effect. Please, Mr. Trump, rethink your plans to start a trade war, where the average family will get slapped with an average $2,000 extra in costs. Families will suffer, businesses will suffer. You said you'd bring down costs on day one, Donald Trump, yet here, 1 month in, you're doing something that would raise costs significantly for the American people. And when Republicans cut Medicaid, it means health care costs will go soaring for tens of millions of kids, seniors, people with disability, rural communities. So why are the Republicans doing all this? Why are they creating all this havoc, this chaos, this cruelty, and this harm to the American people? Simple. To cut taxes for billionaires and have the American people pick up the tab. Make no mistake about it. This is what a transfer of wealth looks like, away from working Americans and into the bank accounts of the billionaire club. Meanwhile, it's not much better in terms of foreign policy and our own security. Our allies across the world will look at America and see a country in decline under Donald Trump. They will watch in horror an American president continue to curry favors with war criminals like Vladimir Putin, while publicly berating friends, brave, valiant people who've risked their lives and have seen so many of their countrymen die in a valiant fight for freedom, like President Zelensky. He gets berated, Putin gets praised. What is going on? Rest assured that nobody on earth was happier with what happened last Friday in the Oval Office than Vladimir Putin. Our allies will also watch in horror as Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth make America less safe. It's the world less safe. There's no other way you can look at it when they give Putin a free pass to launch cyber attacks against the U.S. while we disarm our own cyber operations against Russia. Can you believe that? Letting Putin attack us, and we're saying we won't attack him in terms of cyber warfare. What is going on? The world's turned inside out and upside down, all to the detriment of the safety and security of America and its people. Tomorrow, as Donald Trump addresses our nation, our Western allies will wonder about the future of NATO. So these are difficult and dangerous times, and Donald Trump is taking America, our democracy, and the world down a dark and deeply troubling path. But finally, and most importantly, the American people will not take Donald Trump's agenda lying down. You can see frustration boil over in town halls in Georgia and Kansas and Oregon and everywhere in between. Republican leaders are telling their members to cancel town hall meetings. They're running away from the people because they know how badly the people have been hurt by what they're doing. Maybe they don't want to do it, but they're forced to because President Trump wants tax breaks for billionaires. You can see the frustration in the polls, too. A majority of Americans believe that Donald Trump has ignored the #1 issue they care about, inflation, rising costs. You can see the frustration online. Last week, I joined a Zoom. Over 3,000 New Yorkers got on the Zoom, ready to mobilize against Republican attacks on Medicaid. And many of my colleagues had similar meetings with similar strong responses. People are ready. They're energized. You can also see it in the courts. The American people can rest assured that whenever the administration breaks the law, we'll take them to court. It will be one of our best tools to protecting our country and putting a stop to the worst abuses of Donald Trump's agenda. And for the most part, the courts are rejecting much of what Donald Trump has tried to do. The more Donald Trump pushes our democracy to the limit, the more Americans will push back. Organizing is never easy, but it works. It works. That's what we'll continue to do. We shall organize here in the Congress, organize in the public square, organize in court to protect the country we all know and love. Nothing that Donald Trump says tomorrow will change that fact. Now on Social Security. Something terrible is happening that Democrats have long warned about. American Social Security benefits, one of the most sacred things people have, one of the most popular federal programs that has ever been created. Social Security benefits are coming under attack. Last Friday, Elon Musk claimed that Social Security is the biggest Ponzi scheme of all time. And now the Trump administration has announced massive cuts, more than 7,000 workers to the Social Security Administration. These cuts could affect workers who process checks, answer customer service calls, work in field offices across the country. The cuts could very well delay Social Security benefits. It means longer times on the phone to resolve issues. Everyone knows how frustrating it is, especially seniors who need their checks. And they haven't gotten them, and they want to get on the phone and find out what happens, and now have to wait for hours. It could mean local offices, like in my home state, close down. It could mean more Americans get sicker, go hungry, get their checks far too late. You don't need to scratch your head and wonder what Donald Trump and DOJ are doing when they fire Social Security staffers and call Social Security a scam. They're getting ready to go after people's benefits, plain and simple. Let's be clear. If Americans can't get their checks in time because staffers have been fired, that is a cut in benefits. If Americans can't get an issue resolved over the phone because there's nobody to take calls, that is a cut in benefits. If field offices are closed, if troubleshooting is halted, if checks come late in the mail, that too is a cut in benefits. The only scam going on here is the one where the President of the United States would try to fleece Social Security from the American people to help pay for tax cuts for their billionaires club. Democrats will not let it happen. And finally, on Linda McMahon, the nominee for Secretary of Education. I'm very proud that every single Democrat will vote against Ms. McMahon. Ms. McMahon's confirmation would be a slap in the face to students, parents, teachers who care about our public schools. Americans believe in public education. They don't want to see these cuts. They don't want to see the Department of Education abolished. If the Trump administration follows through on cuts to education, schools will lose billions in funding. And what's going to happen, Mr. and Mrs. Average American taxpayer? Your property taxes will go up. The least popular tax probably that there is. The American people do not want to see cuts to education and the consequent rising property taxes. But that is the danger of confirming Ms. McMahon. Before Republicans vote for Ms. McMahon, you should remember, slashing funds for schools, students, parents, and teachers, all for the sake of billionaire tax breaks, is a very bad idea. Senate Democrats know it's a horrible idea. The American people know it's a horrible idea. Today, we'll see where Senate Republicans stand. Yield the floor. Note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Watch President Trump's address to Congress on March 4th at 9 p.m. Eastern on our YouTube channel at FedNet TV. This program is copyrighted by Federal Network, incorporated and provided only for informational and educational purposes. Unauthorized reproduction, distribution, or use of this episode without expressed written permission from FedNet is prohibited.